Hello, and welcome to GZERO Media's presentation of the top risks of 2022. I'm Shari Friedman, Managing Director of the Climate and Sustainability Practice at Eurasia Group. Each year, Eurasia Group publishes a forecast of the biggest global political risks that are most likely to play out in the coming months. A pandemic entering the third year, the world's two biggest economies at odds with each other and at home, climate change, they all, among others, made the list. And here to tell you why and what it means for the world around us are the masterminds behind the report. Ian Bremmer is the president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Cliff Cupchin is Eurasia Group's chairman. Before we start, if you have any questions for Ian, Cliff, or any of the experts that will be joining us later, you can tweet them to GZERO Media using the hashtag TopRisks2022. Cliff, Ian, welcome.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So let's start with the big picture. Ian, what's the overarching theme to this year's list? And also, amid the risks, is there any good news?
I think I want to start with the good news because, we're saying Happy New Year and also because so many people are feeling a level of despair, despondency. We've been through 2 years of pandemic. The leadership of our governments, particularly in the United States, a lot of people deeply unhappy with there's so much political tribalism and polarization. So maybe start with a few things that are actually much more positive. 3 things I would focus on. Number one, in the wealthy economies in particular, but in other countries as well, in relatively short order, the pandemic will become endemic. There is so much political pressure to get kids back into schools, to go back to work, to go out, to be normal again. The Biden administration, European leaders, they're not going to be able to hold back against that, irrespective of what the science says. And furthermore, you also have such a significant number of vaccines that are out there, booster shots that are out there, and in very short order, COVID pills that work. Put that on top of the massive transmissibility of cases, but not hospitalizations and deaths of Omicron variant. And you're going to feel finally like we are indeed living with the virus within weeks, not within months. I think that's a really big deal. Number 2, the United States-China relationship, which is by far the most important geopolitical relationship in the world, is being driven more by economic underlying realities than by political expediency. Despite all of the headlines, the reality is that both countries need to continue to do business together and find a way to work with each other, even though there is no trust in the relationship. And that is a reality of 2022. It shows up in the risks in a red herring and saying that there is no Cold War between the United States and China coming, but it's absolutely critical. It's the most important relationship in the world. And finally, the fact that there are lots of major democracies out there that are performing really well. Just in the last few months, we've had very successful elections, completely legitimate, with normal transfers of power in Japan, the 3rd largest economy in the world, in Germany, the 4th largest economy in the world, in Canada. It is not a crisis of global democracy. There is a big problem in the United States, the most powerful country in the world, but it doesn't mean that democracy, the wheels of democracy, are just falling off. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to kick this off with some of the things we don't need to panic about, simply because that's not the news that you're going to find everywhere else right now.
That is definitely a better way to start than diving into the dark side. Cliff, let's move over to you. You had outlined a lot of moving pieces that are going on in the world. This GZERO world that Eurasia Group refers to a lot refers to a lack of global leadership. And the introduction to this year's list uses this term geopolitical recession. So what does that mean and how is that manifesting right now?
Well, thanks, Shari, and Happy New Year to everybody. We have used the term geopolitical recession for a while. It means lack of global leadership. Look, I mean, we all, most of us anyway, grew up with things working, with the world working, with global leadership coming from the US, by and large. That is changing. The US is retrenching. There's a bipartisan consensus to move inward in the way the U.S. thinks about itself and focuses. And this year, what we had in the introduction was a slight sort of twist on that, a riff on that, where the two leading powers, superpowers, if you will, U.S. and China, are both consumed by domestic affairs. The U.S. by polarization and social issues, China by zero COVID, which we talk a lot about in the report. which in turn leads to one of our risks, what we'll talk about later, I hope, empty lands, where you have conflicts that might not happen otherwise, and you have ungoverned areas. So it's a real, in a sentence, it's geopolitical vacuum.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask you guys both to hang on a second with me over this hour as we bring in some experts to dive more deeply into a few of these risks. And I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anybody that COVID tops our list this year. The opening line of the report says that we are done with the pandemic, but it is not done with us. So Laura Yasitis is Eurasia Group's healthcare consultant. Welcome, Laura. Laura, make sure you unmute yourself. And
Hi,
Laura, the risk of this one in our report is titled "No Zero COVID." So can you take a second and tell us what that means?
Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, so no zero COVID, put simply, means that China's approach against previously used in the pandemic isn't going to work with Omicron. And now, coming at this with the healthcare policy background, I tend to think of these things in terms of cases and hospitalizations and deaths. But China is a pretty unique situation, and we need to think about it with a broader picture. So unlike most other countries, China actually has the infrastructure to aggressively trace contacts and isolate cases, as they've been doing, trying to isolate the cases to one place and keep the rest of the economy functioning, which worked pretty well in the first year when most of the country lived relatively normal lives, and while other countries had these kind of horrific amounts of illness and death. But in the past year, the strategy started to be less appealing. It was challenged by Delta and more widespread lockdowns and closures. We saw in Xi'an the past few weeks that a city of 13 million people were kept at home, and local government officials were bringing vegetables door to door because they couldn't leave their houses. And so it started to look like the zero COVID strategy was getting more and more difficult to maintain. But they had the exit strategy. They had over 83% of the population was fully vaccinated with Chinese domestic vaccines. So there was this possibility that they'd have some gradual opening at some point by the end of the next year. But Omicron changes that, because the Chinese vaccines, it turns out, are not good at all at stopping transmission of the Omicron variant. And we're still not sure how well they're going to do against severe disease, but that's probably not something that China's going to want to test in their population. So if they found Delta challenging, Omicron's going to be nearly impossible to stop with the same playbook. So they're not heading for necessarily a health catastrophe with lots of illnesses and deaths, but rather that they're likely to try to double down on the goal of zero COVID, but they're going to need to use more severe measures to achieve that goal. We're going to see lockdowns like we did in Xi'an. We might see those repeated around the country, and it's going to be like this game of whack-a-mole, trying to stop each small outbreak as it happens. So the bottom line is that China is incredibly committed to this goal of zero COVID, and it's going to be increasingly more difficult to keep that up without seeing hits to their growth, even if they add stimulus to the economy as we're expecting, and that's going to have effects for the rest of the world.
And China is clearly incredibly integral into the entire global story around COVID. And we're going to get back to that in a moment. But before we do, Laura, I was hoping that you could talk more about the other countries that are trying to live with the virus. We've already seen substantial inequities highlighted by COVID. So how might these contribute to prolonging the pandemic?
Right. So yeah, we've talked about China, and Ian mentioned a bit that the developed world they're kind of, a lot of the advanced industrialized economies are going to be on their way towards living with the virus pretty successfully soon. But we do have these inequalities, and we need to think about what that means. So those advanced industrialized economies, things might look bad now, as Ian was saying, but even with all these breakthrough infections, we know the mRNA vaccines are great against severe disease. Boosters make them better. And there's even some experts calling for moving away from publicizing the number of cases, which keep going up, and focusing more on illness and death, much like we do for the flu each season, that we want to think of other ways to measure the severity of these outbreaks. It's not just the number of cases. And as you mentioned as well, these oral medications are becoming available that are going to be pretty effective at preventing severe disease. So we're still going to see a lot of infections, and policy missteps like not having enough tests might contribute to a bit of a rocky road in the next few months, but the end really is in sight for a lot of the developed world. Unfortunately, for the developing economies, these big inequalities that you mentioned are really going to be pretty important. The highly vaccinated countries have close to or over 80% of their populations vaccinated, whereas less than 8% of most people in the poorest countries in the world have received even one shot. And many of those vaccines were with these non-mRNA vaccines, not the Pfizer or the Moderna, that still hold up really well against severe disease and might even have some effect against transmission with a booster. They're getting these other shots. They've used a lot of these other shots, which might still hold up decently against severe disease, but so few people have gotten them. And they're not going to do anything to stop transmission. And so we have these risks of continued outbreaks. And that's a pretty big risk in itself. But additionally, one thing that a lot of us worry about is that the longer COVID circulates, the more mutations can accumulate. And that raises the risks of seeing a new variant that might act differently than what we've seen before. So we saw Delta come out of India and now Omicron from Southern Africa, where not only are vaccination rates low, but HIV levels mean that there are a lot of immunocompromised people. And there's this idea that Omicron developed maybe in a chronic infection that lasted months in someone whose immunocompromised system couldn't clear the virus. And now it's spread all over the world. So just like when we have poor growth and inequality between countries that affect the global economy, now we're seeing that these health inequalities could come back and affect the rest of us as well. Thank you.
So we're seeing a lot of inequality, totally different story in industrialized and in developing countries. And the effect of that affects everybody. And so, Cliff, I'd like to turn to you to kind of the ramifications of that story. What will these continued outbreaks mean for economic growth in 2022, both in the industrialized countries and also in emerging markets?
A few thoughts. First, what we're really writing about is China. There's a triple threat in China going on right now. A public health threat, if not a crisis, Laura, the more infections, something they really don't want and are fighting, have to fight to contain. Secondly, a political threat. Xi Jinping has attached himself, he's just attached his sternum to the zero COVID policy. As that starts not to look so good, he's not he's going to face political challenges. And third, an economic threat. The economic threat, lockdowns disrupt the economy. No growth is going to go through the floor, but stimulus is something that will unwind a lot of what the Chinese leadership has done to rebalance the economy over the last years. So that's where it begins. In developed markets, yes, we will move to an endemic, as Ian said. There will still be headwinds from inflation, persistent inflation, from supply chains. And Laura introduced the emerging market situation, I think, quite well. What we do see in EMs, though, is this uncomfortable combination of high debt and rising costs of capital set against the poor healthcare situation. That leads to the potential for financial distress, likely this year, as you write about in the report, which could in some countries even become restructuring or defaults. Countries in Latin America, Tunisia, we have a short list of very vulnerable countries.
Thanks. And moving kind of drilling down a little bit more, Cliff, you touched upon China, as did Laura. Ian, I want to drill down a little more. The impact of COVID on China affects not just this country itself, but really the whole world, given the pivotal role that China has in the global supply chain. Can you talk about how COVID is likely to unfold and what the global ramifications are going to be?
Look, what we know is that China has the strongest governance capacity in terms of political strength of its federal system of any major economy in the world. Sometimes that's good when you need to roll over internal divisions to ensure that you can build infrastructure, for example. The reason why China's been so successful in becoming the second largest economy of the world and increasing life expectancy, increasing education rates, increasing the wealth of the average Chinese citizen over the last 40 years is because the Chinese government has been able to break through any internal roadblock. But there is a real downside to that. And the downside that we are going to see this year is that a policy that worked incredibly well in 2020 in responding to COVID, the disease has changed. It is literally a different pandemic today than it was 2 years ago, but the Chinese policy has not, and Xi Jinping is completely invested in it, a zero COVID policy. And that means that the Chinese government, unlike any other country, will be able to continue to push and push and push, despite enormous damage being done domestically and internationally, to economic shutdowns, to difficulties and closures in supply chain. The fact itself that Xi Jinping has not left the country since January 2020, and the diplomatic implications of that, the inability of China to effectively project its influence with other countries around the world, precisely because they can't do the sort of diplomacy that other countries have been able to do. China cannot move towards living with the virus, at least until their own mRNA vaccines are domestically produced and rolled out at scale. And we're looking at the end of 2022 at a minimum. Think about the fact that we have Pfizer, we have Moderna, we know they work, and the Chinese government has refused to license either of those vaccines for their own population. Why? Because their government is so powerful they can get away with it, even despite the enormous implications for their own domestic economy and well-being. I mean, unfortunately for the world, the second most powerful economy happens to be an authoritarian state capitalist country. And that creates an enormous amount of uncertainty and volatility as we think about global risks for 2022.
Yeah, all of these risks seem to be bleeding into a lot of the other risks that we're going to be talking about later. And Laura, before I let you go, we do have a question coming in. The question from our viewers is, would exporting COVID therapeutics be the best way to help poor countries instead of vaccines? We've got a couple of minutes, but briefly, if you could touch on this.
I don't think so. That's just off the top of my head. I hadn't, because the thing is, a lot of these therapeutics, they depend on having an accurate test done quickly within the first day or two of infection. And so you have to have the testing infrastructure up. You have to have a lot of things that the countries who haven't managed to vaccinate hardly any of their population are a whole lot less likely to have access to in the first place. And so that's going to limit the effectiveness of these therapeutics. So that's kind of my first thought. Yeah, I think that's about where I'm going to leave it one.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, again, this is highlighting the difference in reaction and ability and the tools available between the industrialized countries and the developing countries, which really seems to be a theme of COVID. And again, you know, the inflation, the supply chains, the debt, all of these are the underlying factors that seem to kind of seep their way into all of the risks that we're going to be talking about a little bit more. So Laurie Asitis, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to move on to our next risk. Another consequence of the pandemic has been even further dependence on technology and this expansion of technology into our lives. This not only has an effect on us personally, but it also creates this shifting power dynamic between the governments and tech companies. It's something that Ian's called the technopolar world. I'd like to bring in Eurasia Group's Geotechnology Director, Kevin Allison. And as a reminder, you can tweet questions to GZERO Media using the hashtag #TopRisks2022. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Good to see you. Kevin, at the heart of this risk is this idea that nation states are facing serious geopolitical competition from big tech companies. So can you explain what that means?
Sure. Well, I think in very simple terms, for the past roughly 4 centuries, since the 1600s, the nation state, as opposed to city-states or some other form of government unit, has been the primary actor in geopolitics. It's nation states that wield power in physical space. They kind of set the rules. They determine the course of international relations. And the idea behind the technopolar moment is that the rise of a handful of very large and very influential tech companies is disrupting that. It's effectively disrupting not just our lives being disrupted by a few decades of digital revolution, but disrupting a few centuries of geopolitics. Now, the question is why? A few reasons, and I think it's important to note here You mentioned governments and big tech companies are increasingly competing to be influential geopolitical actors. There have been powerful companies in the past, going all the way back to companies like the East India Company, to big oil during the height of its political power. These companies have acted in very influential ways, but there's a big difference between them and the biggest tech companies today, which is that all of those predecessors were operating exclusively in physical space, where governments really do have ultimately the final say. What we think is different about our technopolar moment today is that these technology companies are creating an entirely new dimension of geopolitics in digital space, where they, and not governments, have the most influence. They are the primary actors. They are the primary architects because they are actually building it and running it. And they are also still the primary enforcers. So it's that shift, it's that the creation of a new dimension of geopolitics that I think is very different. And where it turns from a trend or an observation into a risk is that I think that even big tech companies themselves would admit they are not particularly good at governance. So at a time when we talk about a G0 world in which no one country or nation state is capable of exercising global leadership, and it's left global politics a bit of a mess, when you look at the virtual world, it's arguably even worse, because it's not that these companies are failed states or anything like that, but you could argue they're maybe closer to emerging markets that have suddenly grown and become very influential, but haven't yet developed the capacity to govern the spaces that they're creating, which are having effects on geopolitics, not just in the world's developed economies, not just in the US and China, but in emerging markets as well. And that's creating a series of challenges as governments and companies compete and attempt to litigate who ultimately will have control and sovereignty over this space. It's going to make things like disinformation worse. It's going to fuel US-China competition. It's going to continue to pose problems around privacy and the use of data that will feed into some of these other trends, whether it's COVID-related disinformation or US-China competition over technologies like AI and quantum computing. So that is the heart of the risk. It's the heart of the argument.
Mm-hmm. And Ian, you've written a lot about the difference between companies that act as national champions versus globalists and techno-utopians. This is sort of like this differentiation that Kevin was also touching upon. Could you break this down for us?
Well, what's interesting is that the United States and China have within their territories the preponderance of these dominant tech companies. They're not in Europe, they're not in Japan. Now, the Americans and the Chinese have completely different systems. The United States system is all about animal spirits and entrepreneurs, and really is meant to sort of drive the private sector. And China, of course, is a state capitalist authoritarian system where the government is the most important actor. So you would think that would mean that the tech companies would be radically different, that the United States companies would be all about just, individual entrepreneurs, and the Chinese companies would be completely aligned with the state. In reality, it's much more complicated than that. But both in the United States and in China, you have tech companies that are some that are more aligned with governments, and you have some that are like, for example, in the US, Microsoft and Amazon positioning themselves much more as national champions. And in the case of China, you have some of the tech companies that are positioning themselves much more aligned with the private sector and trying to make money, and the governments don't really have a handle on them. And by the way, one of the reasons that the Chinese government went after Jack Ma and that they've said that some of these companies can't IPO in the US is precisely because they know that these companies have enormous amounts of power, and the Chinese government is uncomfortable with it. So it's not like all of these companies are national champions and they're running in lockstep with the Chinese government. The one difference, major difference between the US and China in this front is that you do have what I call techno-utopians in the United States, which are individual companies that really believe that the government is going away, that there will not be effective government space going forward. They want to live and exist in a non-state environment. This is, what all of the crypto bros and, Ethereum, for example, and Vitalik Buterin certainly feel this way. This is a lot of what you hear from Elon Musk when he talks about the future of his influence globally, and even to a degree what Mark Zuckerberg talks about with Meta. In China, techno-utopians are absolutely considered anathema to the system, and the Chinese government is doing everything possible to ensure that would-be Chinese billionaires are not going to adapt to that model.
So, Cliff, what would it take to create a regulation? I mean, like a meaningful regulation of multinational tech companies. What would this look like?
Probably can't. For the reason that, look, I mean, we're dealing in as Kevin was getting at, a new space here. It's digital space where people spend a lot of their lives. You take the 3D version of that, it's the metaverse, which is just such a lovely word that people are going to probably want to spend more time there. I know I do. The keys to the space are controlled by these incredibly rich, incredibly smart companies. And I think what's key to some of what is being argued in this risk is that intrinsically that space is not available to governments in a real way. Now, what could trigger it? An Uber crisis. Sort of something like January 6th on steroids, where it becomes incredibly clear to the world, kind of like in a World War sense, that what's going on is wrong, and you have this incredible pressure for agreed norms. And regulation, after all, is agreed norms. I certainly hope it doesn't happen, which is a funny thing to say about regulation, and I don't think it will happen.
So, Kevin, this in the lack of regulation, right? That means that there's an increased risk of the spread of disinformation. And you touched upon this when you spoke before, but it's such a big deal. I'm hoping that you could maybe drill down. It's underpinning a lot of our other risks. Can tech companies effectively police themselves then, given what Cliff is saying, that we're not going to see political regulation? Can they police themselves and their own algorithms?
Well, to be fair to the big tech companies, they're certainly trying. I think, though, that it's extremely difficult because the biggest firms in particular are operating at global scale with tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of users, and algorithms that kind of supercharge the way that information circulates. And so I think it's a massive challenge, even where companies are devoting resources to tackling it. I think it's going to remain difficult. And I also think that the key point here is also that it's not that governments aren't trying to regulate. In the first 6 months of this year, it's likely that the European Union, for example, will adopt new legislation imposing new requirements on companies around their online content and around how they compete with each other in digital markets. So there is regulation, but I think the key point is that is just the kind of most superficial level of the type of power that tech companies are exercising over this space. It's not just about whose account stays up or whose account stays down, or whether you've got moderators looking for hate speech and are transparent about what you're doing. The influence of the biggest tech companies goes all the way down to individual lines of code and the structure of algorithms, the way that the actual sites and the actual digital space they're creating works on your brain. And that is a type of influence, I think, that, first of all, bad actors who will look for ways around the latest disinformation rules can find ways to take advantage of. I think it's a type of influence that governments will really struggle to get ahead of and really contain. And even the tech companies themselves, this is part of the risk, is that tech companies themselves, even making their best efforts, are going to struggle to kind of get on top of this. And so to me, that really is the essence of the risk, is that this vacuum of governance that we're seeing in the physical world among nation states is extending into digital space and is arguably exacerbated by some of these problems of digital space, including disinformation.
Right. So we've got a question coming in from the listeners that Kevin, you kind of just touched upon. It's which country is cracking down hardest on big tech? Now, you mentioned the EU is coming out with regulations. Just if you put that in the context of all the countries, how would you answer that question?
Well, I think that the story of last year was China and its regulatory crackdown or rectification of some of its biggest tech companies and entrepreneurs. The story this year, certainly in the first half, the focus will be on Europe and the trajectory of these two really big and important pieces of legislation: the Digital Services Act, which is largely about content, and the Digital Markets Act, which is largely about competition, particularly how the biggest tech companies that Europe dubs gatekeeper companies should interact with other companies that rely on them and interact with it, and how they should compete with one another. So Europe will be the focus of a lot of attention. In the US, I think that the reality is that a combination of political gridlock and a lack of real urgency among lawmakers means that the US will continue to lag, at least at the legislative level, in providing global leadership here. It's going to have to rely on executive branch rulemaking and other types of processes that are a little bit unique to the US system, certainly among the world's biggest technology powers, that are going to be very slow moving. And so the countries that move to impose new rules, although we do think it's going to struggle to dent tech companies' influence, are going to move into this vacuum. So it's really about, I think, the decisions that China and the EU make around how they are going to attempt to navigate this contested space that will be the most important things to watch, but particularly the EU this year.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. I mean, what we're hearing is that there's this vacuum of leadership, and I think what you guys all have also outlined is this incredible power that that's going in through the technology right now. So the combination of that indeed causes a huge risk. Kevin, Allison, thank you so much for joining us. We're now going to move on from disinformation and the power of big tech to American democracy, not unrelated, and the power and the potential danger lurking under as the U.S. heads into the 2022 midterms. John Lieber is the managing director of the U.S. practice at Eurasia Group. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Shari.
So, John, as many people in the United States are noting, we're just a couple of days away from the first anniversary of the Capitol insurrection. What has changed in U.S. politics since that day? I mean, has anything changed since that day?
Yeah, I think a lot's changed, actually. I think primarily among the Republican base. So if you look at, the riots happened, and instead of there being a repudiation of President Donald Trump, which frankly I expected after the riots, because of his role in instigating them, what you have instead is this myth of the stolen election that has grown among the Republican base. Public opinion surveys suggest that over half of Republican voters, particularly those who get their news primarily from right-wing media, believe the election was actually stolen from the president. And to be clear, this is a mass illusion. There is no evidence whatsoever that the election was stolen. The election results at the state level in Georgia and Arizona were certified by Republican legislatures and Republican governors, and Republicans in the House and Senate certified that Joe Biden was the true winner of this election. So there's no truth to this whatsoever. But among the Republican base, there's been very little backlash against President Trump and this growing myth in the stolen election. So this has increased tribalism. This has fueled backlash against President Biden. This cemented President Trump's already really strong hold on the Republican Party and has contributed to really deep polarization in the US. And so while the insurgency itself is a historically significant and important event, it's this lack of backlash. And in fact, that to me is more important. And in fact, I think what's really meaningful is that in some conservative and right-wing outlets, you're seeing commentators start to really apologize and even forgive what happened in the among the rioters. You're seeing a lot of whataboutism. What about the George Floyd riots? What about the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle last year, which is kind of trying to equate these things with what happened on January 6th. And you're also seeing people even try to make a martyr out of people like Ashley Babbitt, who was killed by a Capitol police officer during the riot. So all of this, I think, is really profound shifts that's fueling tribalism and fueling polarization in the US. And President Biden has really been unable to try to heal or bridge any of those gaps, which was one of the central premises of his campaign in 2020.
So the flame went down for a while, but it's coming back even stronger. And so it's pretty common. I mean, this sort of leads into the next question. It's pretty common for the party of a city president to lose seats in congressional midterms. But this risk has a far more ominous tone to it right now. And can you talk about the weight of this year's midterms?
Yeah, so what's different about the midterms is President Trump. I mean, so no president ever has held on to the myth that the election was stolen from him in this way. And no political party has been as strategically focused as taking control of the electoral mechanisms the way the Republican Party is right now. So it's actually kind of incredible. If you look at 6 of the closest 6 states, swing states in 2020, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, all of them have governor seats that are open this cycle. That will be they will be electing governor. They'll be holding governor elections this cycle. 5 of them have secretary of states that will be elected in this cycle. In Pennsylvania, you'll get a potentially new governor who will have the ability to appoint a secretary of state. So you can come out of this electoral cycle in 2022 with Republicans in control of the House of Representatives and the Senate at the federal level, and have unified control of the mechanisms of governance in the 6 swing states that decided the 2020 election. At the same time, within the Republican Party, there's this effort by President Trump to put in place politicians who support his claims the election was stolen. What does that mean? It means that in 2024, you could potentially have essentially a Trumpified Republican Party running the key campaign electoral mechanisms in these important states, setting up a situation where he could actually steal the election. And I know this sounds hyperbolic and kind of crazy, but it's true. And if you listen to President Trump's public statements, if you look at some of the strategy that's going on by like Steve Bannon, some of his allies on the outside, it's clear that this is their intention, and they think this is something that they could actually do, depending on what happens in the 2022 midterms.
So, Ian and Cliff, we're going to come back to some of what you're talking about, John, in a moment. But Ian, anybody who's been following the top risks for a while might note that the U.S. politics has been at or near the top of this list for 3 years running. So what does this say to you? And Ian, we'll start with you first, and then Cliff, I'd like to get your take on this as well.
It's a fundamental change in how we think about the world. When we started the firm in 1998, the United States was never on this list because the legitimacy of U.S. political institutions, stability and the resilience of representative democracy, and the level of its consistency in the eyes of both allies and adversaries was basically unquestioned. It was an anchor for the geopolitical system, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, but nonetheless stable. And so most of your risks were about geopolitical conflict at the global level, or it was about country risk among certain emerging markets, developing states, within the Middle East, all of that. Over the course of the last several years, increasingly, not just has the United States become a political risk, it's become the core political risk, because the most powerful country in the world, and I want to be clear, none of this is about the United States being in decline in terms of its power, its military power, its economic power, the importance of its companies, its technology companies, its educational capacity. I mean, even its cultural influence around the world. These things are frankly undiminished. And indeed, you could argue that the US is asymmetrically more powerful compared to its allies than it was 5, 10, or 20 years ago, in part because of the response of the tech companies to the pandemic. But the US as a democracy has fundamentally eroded, and significantly so. So much so that this morning, in an NPR and Ipsos poll, 64% of Americans responded that they believed the United States democracy was in fundamental crisis and could break. That is it's a staggering number. It's a number that would have been inconceivable to anyone that was watching this back in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, or in 2001 after the attacks on 9/11. And as you know, in just a couple of days, we're going to have January 6th. It'll be the first anniversary of the horrible events that we saw in this country when the Capitol building was occupied. And the response to January 6th is not a country that's coming together. It's going to be a 1-6 investigation that the Democrats are driving in the House and in Congress. And it's going to be former President Trump with a press conference rallying his supporters, a majority of Republican voters, saying that the election has been stolen and has to be redressed. This is fundamentally a democracy that does not know or believe what it stands for. And the level of uncertainty that drives both for the United States and its political future, and also for other countries around the world that either rely upon it for leadership or feel like it could take advantage of an absence of such leadership in being able to exploit its own interests. And we will see this we are seeing this today with Russia in Ukraine. We are seeing this with Iran in response to the broken JCPOA, the nuclear deal. And we could see this in the future with China over Taiwan and in the South China Sea. These are fundamental issues driving the way we think about the world today.
Cliff, do you have anything to add to this? It's a pretty intense outlook, and you might be able to flesh this out on what this might look like. I mean, it's something that nobody's ever really contemplated before.
Let me just top this off, I guess, with I mean, to me, the United States is a little bit like an internal Cuban Missile Crisis, where you have the Republican Party and Democratic Party coming at each other instead of the Americans and the Soviets. But there's going to be a massive explosion unless we do something. So look, I think that, Ian and I have written about this 3 years in a row. It's clear there's a real problem. What do we do? Is there anything we can do about it? I thought Joe Biden was a step towards doing something about it. I was around him a lot when I worked on Capitol Hill. I spent hours with him. He was a real healer. He was a real bridge builder. As president, he's thrown his lot more with where the momentum is the Democratic Party, with the left. I think we need some kind of national dialogue. And it may be too late, but it may be worth trying. In theory, I think everybody in New York should drive to Western Pennsylvania for a weekend. Everybody in DC ought to drive to West Virginia for a weekend and actually talk to people. Now, that's a novel idea because nobody's going to do it probably, and nobody's ever done it, which is the problem. But unless we can take the steering wheel away from the Progressives and Democratic Party and the base in the Trump Party as it now exists, there's no hope. I will add that in my own dealings, and limited, there is more hope at the grassroots level, I think, than at the elite politics level, where things are just locked in. So I would just offer that.
Yeah. So increased dialogue. I mean, this sort of gets to a little bit of this issue of everybody's kind of sitting in their own silo. Even technologically, we are sitting in our own silo. And before we leave, I want to hand the floor back to John for any final comments on this.
Yeah, I think this polling result Ian talks about with the NPR poll is really interesting because, while there's a lot of this mythos of the stolen election in 2020 and the Republican Party, and that sets up this risk that could come to fruition in 2024, the Democrats also are being primed to believe that the results of the election are illegitimate due to voter suppression. So you've seen a lot of changes in law over the last several years, first to extend voting during the pandemic, and then changes that are either reflect backlash against those extensions or permanency of those extensions in blue states. And when that's happening in red states, you're seeing Democrats say, well, look, they're just doing this to suppress minority votes. So whoever wins in 2024, if President Trump wins the election cleanly or another Republican wins the election cleanly, you're going to have a lot of Democrats who reject those results because of this perception of voter suppression among minorities. So this is a really toxic environment for democracy, and it's a new era that we really just haven't seen in the country like this recently.
Yeah, it feels like there's very few clear solutions. Leaving out Cliff's idea of everybody kind of having a cross-country drive for a dialogue. So
I want to throw something out. I think one thing that we need to recognize is that for the last 30 years, there's been this presumption that democracy is the model that's going to win. And I think globally, and it's not clear that we can say that anymore. And some of that is this fundamental question of whether American political institutions are actually fit for purpose. But also a big question is whether, to the degree that suddenly these new technologies are becoming so powerful that the ability of governments to have surveillance states and drive political and social behaviors in ways that they never possibly could before, I think there's an open question the next 5 or 10 years about what the forms of governance will be globally that are actually seen to be most successful for citizens. And unfortunately, what's happened and what is happening in the United States makes the ability of the Americans to have a strong voice in that global debate really diminished in a way that we don't have a problem doing that when we talk about building a strong military or building a strong corporation or even building a strong university. But a political system right now, that is completely up for grabs.
So with a, a very unusual U.S. political system, we are going to thank you so much to John Lieber for joining us. We're going to move on to the next risk. There's so much more in the top 2022 list of top risks, and we're not actually going to have time to go through all of it. However, you can read the full report at eurasiagroup.net. And in the meantime, I'd like to touch on a couple more themes very briefly. Further down the list at number 9 is corporates losing the culture wars. Angela Hoffman is the Industrial and Consumer Practice Head at Eurasia Group. Welcome, Angela.
Thanks, Shari. So excited to be here.
Great. Angela, so what does this risk entail and why does it matter?
So, Shari, this risk means that the world's most visible brands are going to have a really rocky year. Some are already under the microscope given their sponsorship of large global events, other because they've taken or not taken stances on politically charged issues such as voting rights. And what we're seeing is consumers empowered by social media are using their voices and purchasing power to assert pressure on non-market issues, and politicians with a focus on supply chains, including forced child slave labor, essentially pressuring multinationals to have visibility to and accountability for all levels of production. Think cotton to clothing, farm to fork. But navigating, now, go ahead, Terry.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I would just say, but navigating this is going to be a double-edged sword because the firms will face two-way risks. So for example, they speak out on human rights in China, they face fury from regulators and hypercharged consumers utilizing social media in China. On the other hand, if they don't comply, they will face fury from regulators and consumers here in the US. And further complicating matters, the pressure is also coming from employees who are expecting their leaders to take a stand on these culture war issues. In additional issues such as workplace diversity, inclusion at a national, state, and local level. So what this means, basically what we're calling out is that companies must focus on ESG with a particular focus on that S. Many cases costly, right? Reinventing supply chains and investing in compliance issues. But with the expectations from the public and new regulations on the way, there's just simply no going back.
Right. And it kind of moving on with this concept of the S, which is the social and ESG. Ian, this is particularly prominent in the Beijing Olympics, which are just a month away. Will we see increased pressure on the private sector to take this stance on China's human rights, given, and also you could put this in the context of this kind of no-win situation that Angela outlined?
Yeah, absolutely you will. And even though the Biden administration has really tried not to make this a problem, right? I mean, they waited to say anything on a diplomatic boycott. They were hoping maybe given Omicron that, you just wouldn't invite any foreigners and then Biden wouldn't have to say anything about it. And even so, he said, we're not going to do an athletic boycott. We're not going to do a corporate boycott. So all of the US sponsors are going to continue to sponsor. The NBC is going to be covering it. And we'll talk about the Beijing Olympics. But look, everybody knows that it is a no-brainer for a member of the House or Senate to go after people that are doing business in China, doing big business in China. No human rights. It's a dictatorship. Xinjiang. You've got the administration, even though they didn't put a boycott on, they still said that the Chinese government is committing genocide against its people, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, over 1 million in concentration camps. At some level, the idea of the United States doing business with a country that proactively commits genocide, no matter how much profit you're making, is really hard to swallow. And so on the one hand, we're completely interdependent economically, and we desperately need each other for our own national interests, for even our national security. And on the other hand, we consider parts of their political system to be antithetical even to the challenged American political system that we're experiencing today. And so, of course, that means that corporate CEOs that are out there, if they're saying, yeah, we want to do more business in China, are going to take it on the chin. Because the only thing they can do is speak out of two sides of their mouths, right? They have to be woke when they're the NBA talking about Black Lives Matter in the US, but they have to be really quiet because they can't offend the Chinese government, who has the most important future consumer base and fan base that they're looking to take advantage of. And that's the same thing for Hollywood, and it's the same thing for manufacturers and retailers and you name it, right? And so, they want to stay quiet because the best thing to do when you have to speak out of two sides of your mouth, just hope that the whole issue goes away, but it's not going to go away. It's going to be more challenging when you got the Beijing Olympics and everyone's only focused and talking about China for a few weeks. yeah, this is going to be a tough one for them to get through. There's no question.
Yeah, and the role of social media makes it even more difficult to keep anything quiet for sure. And moving a little bit over from the S into the E, so environment, ESG, environment, social governance, moving over onto the E a little bit, Cliff, we touching briefly on climate change, which we worked on with you. This risk we identified the risk in 2022, centering around this clash between the energy crunch and national climate commitments. And there's also a piece of this dynamic that intersects with corporates. The pressure to decarbonize is not only coming from countries, but from consumers demanding this change from big corporations. So could you just expound on this?
Sure, it's a great example of where consumer pressure is going to exert its will on firms, on corporates. There's a very, very strong sentiment for clean supply chains, for clean tech, for companies to abide by new and evolving climate norms. That is likely to be a rough ride this year, given the thesis of that we worked on together, Shari, the thesis of our risk, which is that it's going to be a bumpy year for the transition, that demand for clean energy won't meet the need, and the gap will probably have to be made up through fossil fuels. So in some ways, both consumers and companies are going to have to hold on to the reins of their horses this year because it's going to be a rough one.
Right. And, we haven't even mentioned in the financial institutions, which I think are also a pretty big powerhouse in pushing this agenda on social environment and governance forward, looking at it as a risk, as an underlying risk. And I'm wondering if, Angela, you want to kind of give any final comments on that, on how companies are seeing sort of their access to capital as well.
Well, I'll look at it a couple different ways. I think there is definitely a greater focus on sort of risk mitigation, but also sort of focusing on how they can be more, not just compliant, but sort of risk adverse or risk ready. That's coming from social investors, and it's coming from a large part of the secondary and tertiary industries that they're impacted on. Again, I don't think this genie is going back in the bottle. It's going to be a requirement to have greater transparency and accountability, and that's not something that you can just push down the supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Angela Hoffman, thank you so much for joining us. So before we go, let's quickly discuss some of the remaining risks from this year's list. And a reminder that this is your final chance to tweet in some questions at #TopRisks2022. Ian, we talked about China culture wars and corporate pressure, but China is also experiencing some domestic pressure. So can you explain this?
Well, this is a combination. You all know about the Evergrande real estate issue, massive bubble in terms of just how far those prices have gone and the underlying value connected with it. And you also have a massive amount of Chinese indebtedness, both in the corporate sector and overall. And then you also have demographics that are getting more challenging. And all of these things are happening at a time when Xi Jinping has consolidated massive political power and is looking to ensure his historic third term at the end of the year. That would be difficult enough. And in the context of that, you have our number one risk, the fact that their zero COVID policy will remain inflexible and it will fail. So all of that means that China is going to have a lot more difficult environment economically on the ground. Now, the Chinese government has the ability to ensure that they hit growth numbers. They can throw cash at sectors if they need to. But that also means that they're much more likely to make mistakes, to overshoot, to create more unsustainability in their government. And they're also going to be doing it in their economy. And they're doing it at a time when the rest of the world is trying to dig out of 2 years of pandemic. Yet China continues to be the factory of the world. It's where stuff is made. It's where all of the ships are taking their goods and they're bringing them around the world. So you're going to have more disruption that is emanating from China. You're going to have a more challenging environment internally inside China. And so the interesting thing is Xi Jinping, who's not traveled anywhere since January 2020, He lost India over the last 24 months because of mistakes in diplomacy. There are very few allies of China around the world. They've invested far less in Belt and Road, about 10% in the last year of what they were investing 8 years ago into the massive infrastructure everywhere else. The fundamental risks around China in 2022 are not about an explosion with the US over Taiwan. They're not about an explosion with the US and allies over the South China Sea and the 9-dash line. No, they are instead about a challenging domestic environment in China and the reliance of the global economy on what happens inside China. That's what 2022 is all about.
Mm-hmm. And moving on to another risk, you both describe US-Russia and US-Iran relationships as being very precarious as we enter into this new year. So let's start off with Russia. We had a listener question asking asking how likely is Putin to invade Ukraine in 2022? So if you could wrap that into your answer, Cliff, why don't we hand this one off to you?
It's a close call. He's on balance. I think he could be satisfied in talks with the US-led West. But, I spent a lot of time around this guy. He thinks Ukraine is his. He will let it live independently-ish as a Finland as a neutral state, but he is very scared of NATO going into Ukraine, of NATO setting up bases there. If he doesn't get the kinds of security assurances, like less US weapons, like less NATO exercises on his borders, we could see a very destabilizing. He could do what he did with Crimea. We should not take it lightly. He's very smart. He's very ferocious. And this is entirely within the realm of possibility.
Ian, do you have anything to add? And also, if you could kind of move your answer into US-Iran nuclear talks as well.
Yeah, the addition I would make is that there's a very big difference between Russia invading Ukraine, which is clearly a red line from the Americans and the Europeans and has been made clear to President Putin, and things that Putin can do to escalate that could divide the US and Europe further. For example, President Putin has said that Russian citizens in occupied Donbass have had acts of genocide committed against them by the Ukrainian government. This is verifiably false, but he said it. And in saying it, the Russian people believe it. And obviously, as Russian president, certainly he has to act, right? So if he doesn't get what he wants diplomatically or some modicum of it, what if he decides that to defend those Russian citizens, that occupied Donbass has to be actually annexed and that Russian tanks need to formally move in? Now, the Americans would find that unacceptable, but would the Europeans put the kind of sanctions against Russia that the Americans would be prepared to do in that environment? Is that really a new invasion? It's territory that they already basically have. That's a problem. It's a vulnerability for Biden. He'd look very weak if he wants to act and the Europeans then don't. Very interesting, just in the last few hours, that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz got in touch with Putin and said he wants to have a one-on-one directly with him. No problem with the Germans meeting with the Russians, of course, but will that be strongly coordinated with the Americans? It needs to be. And this is by far the first major meeting that Scholz is going to have that has geopolitical implications. We'll be watching that carefully. On Iran, it's a different story. On Iran, this is basically the one geopolitical issue that Trump personally threw under the bus. There are a lot of other things he tried to break that Obama had done in the past. I mean, you look at his decision to leave the Paris Climate Accord. Biden gets right back in. He says we're going to leave the World Health Organization. Biden goes right back in and recommits. But on the United States leaving the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal, that bus has left the station. And the Americans can't get back in. The Iranians are significantly down the road in developing their nuclear capabilities within weeks of breakout capacities, we say the ability to develop a bomb. And the Americans need a plan B. And the Gulf allies are not with the US on this. Israel is increasingly looking at, do we need to engage in more sabotage or even direct military strikes against Iran? So the risk around Iran this year is much more significant than it has been in the past as a consequence of the United States shooting itself unilaterally in the foot.
Mm-hmm. What I'm taking from, we're going to have to wrap up, but what I'm taking from this is so much interrelation between all of the risks. You've got COVID with tech, with US democracy, with the dichotomy, in the increased split with industrialized and developing countries, really a lot of interconnection between all of these. And Ian and Cliff, thanks to you guys both for putting this together and also for joining for the explanation today. I'd like to thank the Eurasia Group experts who joined us today as well. As a reminder, you can check the full list of risks, read the report by heading to our website, eurasiagroup.net. I'm Shari Friedman. From all of us here at Eurasia Group and GZERO, thanks for watching and wishing you a wonderful new year.